After Lyndon Johnson assumed the presidency following the assassination of John F. Kennedy, Johnson believed that he needed to get the country behind a big cause. And one of the things they discussed was civil rights. And some of his aides told him that was maybe not a good idea, that he could really damage himself politically. And Johnson fires back at them by saying, well, what the hell is the presidency for? Lyndon Johnson's views on race were certainly shaped by his childhood in Texas. He had all of the privileges and prejudices that a white male who was born in the early years of the 20th century in the South had toward people of color. So if you were to look at the first 2 decades of Johnson's congressional career, and say this is someone who is going to be the most significant president for the cause of racial justice, no one would believe you. The Senate was really where Johnson always dreamed to be. A group of 100 people is sort of the perfect setting for him because he could know everyone really well. And Johnson loved the Senate. He loved that he could, just by working people really hard, make big things happen. He was a master legislator, and his tactics involved everything under the sun you could do to get people on your side. That could mean physically threatening them, but he would also use extreme flattery that no one but a United States senator could believe. Within his first term, he becomes the leader of the Democrats in the Senate. Johnson was probably the second most powerful person in the country. When it becomes clear that JFK is going to be the presidential nominee for the Democratic Party in 1960, there's a lot of reasons why John F. Kennedy would want to have Lyndon Johnson as his vice president. He was a Catholic and a Northerner who was running in a party that depended on the South. What was much less clear to anyone was why on earth Lyndon Johnson, the most powerful Democrat in Washington, would want to be John F. Kennedy's vice president. But when John F. Kennedy makes the offer to Lyndon Johnson, everyone, including the Kennedys, thought that he would certainly turn it down. So everyone is shocked when then Lyndon Johnson says he will leave the Senate and become vice president. John F. Kennedy goes to Dallas on November 22nd, 1963, and is assassinated. Lyndon Johnson was actually riding in the motorcade and had to duck on the floor of his own car. He assumes the presidency on Air Force One later that afternoon. And it's sort of an excruciating moment for him because he's gotten the thing that he's always wanted, but he's gotten it in the worst way possible. If he was ever going to be able to move beyond this sort of mythic force of the Kennedy presidency that was haunting him, he needed to do something big. And he saw the Civil Rights Act as his opportunity to do that. Johnson's masterstroke was to take this Kennedy myth and sort of put it to work for himself. He says, the way that we honor John F. Kennedy is to complete the legacy that he started. Martin Luther King plays an interesting role in the presidency of Lyndon Johnson. He is this figure on the outside that is bringing attention to the issue of civil rights. Johnson realizes he can enlist King to apply public pressure to some of these politicians that Johnson needs to make civil rights legislation move forward. The public reaction to the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is pretty strongly positive among both whites and blacks. And it was really only within the South and within more extreme factions in his own party that his actions were criticized. It becomes pretty clear very early on that Johnson is a unifying figure who has broad support from the country. Johnson is given a great gift in 1964 when the Republicans choose as their nominee Barry Goldwater, who was a staunch conservative and seen as incredibly extreme. And Goldwater, played right into their hands by acting crazy from start to finish in the 1964 campaign. LBJ just destroyed Goldwater all over the country. The 1964 election was about as big a landslide as you could possibly imagine. He realizes better than anyone else it's an opportunity to make significant legislation happen. He wanted to lay the groundwork in private to move on the Voting Rights Act when opportunity arose, and opportunity did arise in March of 1965. Martin Luther King was aware of the slow timetable that officials in Washington were taking on the issue of voting rights. He and other leaders in the civil rights movement staged a major campaign in Alabama. They chose in Selma a white establishment that was particularly inflammatory and inclined toward violence. The country's attention was riveted on Selma when people who were peacefully protesting were mauled in these horrific scenes by police. And it was another one of these moments from the 1960s that really struck the nation's conscience of something that is not supposed to happen in America. And LBJ is presented with a choice. He has to react to it because it's this moment that's crying out for leadership. He could condemn the actions of the white officials in Alabama and then move on, or take this as an opportunity to move the ball forward in a major way. And Johnson decides that this is his moment. He is going to go before the country and speak and say, now is the time when we will do something about voting rights and solve this issue once and for all. Moral clarity is freeing. He knew that he was doing the right thing on voting rights, and he was going to communicate that to the country in a very clear and direct and meaningful way.
There is no Negro problem. There is no Southern problem. There is no Northern problem. There is only an American problem.
The bill passes in August of 1965, and Johnson goes to the Capitol to sign it. And you see him standing in front of a statue of Abraham Lincoln. And that was very much the way that he wanted this moment to be seen, as the completion of the work that Lincoln had begun 100 years before. I mean, Johnson is ultimately a tragic figure. He sets out this goal for himself, and he achieves it. He does more for African Americans than any Democratic president had ever done before. But that's not ultimately what he's remembered for. His presidency gets overtaken by this war in Vietnam, and it's excruciating for him. And he knows, as his presidency starts to spin out of control, that he's not going to be remembered for the things he did on civil rights. He's going to be remembered for his mishandling of the Vietnam War. LBJ's pursuit of civil rights shows leadership at the highest level, which is understanding that there's something greater than himself. LBJ didn't come to the cause of civil rights for totally selfless reasons. He wanted to do something big. He wanted to be great and to be remembered as one of the greatest and most consequential presidents the country had ever had. But the more he devoted himself to the cause of civil rights, the less it became about him, and it really became about the cause.